Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers. I'm Jim Papandrea. This podcast is a production of Catholic Culture. Sign up for our newsletter at catholicculture.org/newsletter. Today we continue our series on the Doctors of the Church with our second episode on St. Bonaventure. St. Bonaventure is called the second founder of the Franciscans, in part because he held the order together in the face of possible schism by the so-called spirituals, or fraticelli. They objected to the idea of the order owning any property, saying that to do so would be to compromise St. Francis's original ideal. But Bonaventure came up with a solution, an attempt at a middle way. The Franciscans would not own property, but they could have perpetual use of property owned by the Church to facilitate their mission. And this solution was confirmed by Pope Nicholas III after Bonaventure's death. Though the spirituals themselves refused to accept it, it became the norm. St. Bonaventure has also been called the Prince of the Mystics for the way that he made the mystical theology of earlier mystics more accessible and brought the trajectory of the mystical tradition that many would say begins with that church father known as Pseudo-Dionysius and led through St. Bernard of Clairvaux to the point where, as Bonaventure believed, anyone could be, if not a true mystic, at least a contemplative. Like many of our doctors, St. Bonaventure was quite prolific, to the point where it's hard to pin down a complete list of all his works. And like several of our doctors, he wrote a commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, as well as commentaries on several biblical books, and many sermons, including sermons in honor of Our Lady, some inspired by St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And he wrote a manual on preaching, as well as several books on those medieval academic debates that were going on in his time. If his colleague, St. Thomas Aquinas, was the great systematizer, you might say that St. Bonaventure is the great summarizer. And he wrote several books pulling together and summarizing several aspects of his own theology, as well as that of those who came before him. The book called the Soliloquium is a compilation of the teachings of the Church Fathers, and the one called the Breviloquium is a summary of his own theology. And he wrote a book called On the Reduction of All the Arts to Theology. The title means that every area of study really all boils down to the most important subject, theology. And no matter what subject you intend to study, if it doesn't lead you closer to God, then you're not doing it right. And his mystical text called The Triple Way, or sometimes called Love Enkindled, or The Kindling of Love, this is a summary of his mysticism, which is heavily influenced by the mysticism of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, and also incorporates the mysticism of St. Francis of Assisi. Bonaventure wrote manuals of life for people in different vocations. For the religious superiors of the Franciscans, he wrote something called On the Six Wings of the Seraph. And for the poor clares, he wrote The Perfection of Life for the Sisters. And for everyone else, he wrote The Tree of Life, which is another one of his mystical texts. The Tree of Life is a meditation on the life and passion of Jesus, with an eye toward the imitation of Christ and his virtues. In fact, this emphasis on the imitation of Christ in every possible way, this is one of the things that comes from St. Francis. And we can see this in Francis's own life, from his imitation of Christ's supposed poverty, all the way to his imitation of the wounds of Christ's passion in his miraculous stigmata. And Bonaventure's Tree of Life would be an important influence on later spiritual writers, such as St. Ignatius Loyola and his spiritual exercises. In the Tree of Life, Bonaventure begins with the reference in Revelation 22, verses 1 and 2, to the tree of life in the heavenly Jerusalem. And then he uses the concept of the 12 different kinds of fruit growing on that tree as an outline for his meditation on the life of Jesus, where each different kind of fruit represents an episode in the life of Jesus, starting with his eternal generation. It's almost like a Stations of the Cross, but of the entire eternal existence of the Son of God. And the point is for the believer to imitate aspects of Christ's life. But not Christ only. At certain points, we are instructed to imitate his Blessed Mother. And I love these lines, which I'm going to paraphrase a bit for clarity in this audio-only medium. But Bonaventure wrote, "As mother and child flee into Egypt, do not let them leave without accompanying them. And as the beloved mother searches for her beloved son, do not cease searching until you have found him." In other words, just as Our Lady went on a journey with Jesus into Egypt, make your whole life a journey of walking with Jesus. And just as Our Lady searched for Jesus when she thought he was lost in Jerusalem, so we should imitate her and search for him until we find him. Now, as you would expect with mystical theology, the connection of biblical types with what they foreshadow is also important. So, just like Adam was the cause of all sin by tasting the forbidden fruit, Jesus was the cure for all sin by tasting the vinegar and gall. And just like the blood and water flowed from Jesus' side on the cross, making our salvation possible, the blood mixed with water in the sacrament of the Eucharist makes the sacrament powerful for the forgiveness of our sin and to bring grace to the believer. In the 1250s, when Bonaventure was in his 30s, he was inspired to spend some time in prayer on Mount Alverna, and this is the very place where St. Francis received the Stigmata. And from his time there, Bonaventure was inspired to write his two most famous documents, which are sometimes described as commentaries on St. Francis's vision on the mountain of the six-winged seraph. One of these documents was the Life of Francis, and this became the standard biography of St. Francis for a long time. According to some accounts, the friars had actually asked him to write this, to compile all the already existing biographies into one, and he ended up writing two versions, a longer and a shorter version. But Bonaventure didn't just collate what was already written. He interviewed those of the first generation of friars who were still alive, those who knew Francis personally. And so, although it's sometimes called a legend, that's really just the Latin word for something you read out loud. And it's actually more like a modern biography than most ancient and medieval biographies. And it became a medieval bestseller. The other book inspired by his time on Mount Alverna is the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, translated as The Journey of the Mind to God, or The Mind's Road to God, or The Soul's Journey into God. But that word, itinerarium, it has the meaning of something more like a pilgrimage. So if it were up to me, I would translate it, The Pilgrimage of the Soul Toward God. And this is one of his mystical writings in which he outlines the ascent toward God that's inherent in contemplative prayer and the mystical experience. And he assumes that it was exactly this kind of ascent into mystical ecstasy that St. Francis had experienced on that mountain. And so, for anyone else who would like to follow in this mystical way, Bonaventure explains and builds on the classic 3 stages of the contemplative life. Those stages are purification, illumination, and perfection. And all this ultimately comes from the mystical theology of Pseudo-Dionysius and others. But in case you're not familiar with these 3 stages, allow me to summarize at the risk of oversimplifying. The stage of purification is characterized by the renunciation of sinful attachments and the practice of the virtues. The stage of illumination is characterized by the imitation of Christ and contemplative prayer. And the final stage, perfection, is one that most people will never experience in this life. That is, it's a mystical union with God that comes from perfectly practicing the virtues and perfectly letting go of all attachments. It's usually assumed that St. Paul had this experience when he talks about a man he knows who was taken up into the third heaven. And of course, Bonaventure assumes that St. Francis had this experience and it left him with the stigmata. But again, most people will never experience this mystical union in this life. For most people who practice contemplative prayer, contemplation is just part of the process of sanctification. Or, as the mystics would say, part of a process of increasing love for God. But for the true mystic, there are momentary experiences of mystical union which are a foretaste of the beatific vision. Or so I'm told. Now, if you're like me, the big question on your mind at this point is, what exactly is the contemplative thinking about in contemplative prayer? Well, to contemplate is to meditate on God alone and nothing else. And this is the distinction that I would make between meditation and contemplation. It might be a bit simplistic for those of you who have studied this, but you might think of it this way. You can meditate on created things. You can meditate on Scripture. You can meditate on the mysteries of the Rosary. You can meditate on holy icons. And you can even meditate on the beauty in creation itself. But all of these things are a means to an end, which is the love and worship of God. Contemplation, on the other hand, is to focus on God directly as an end in himself. And for Bonaventure, this means specifically meditating or contemplating God's divine attributes. So theoretically, you would begin by meditating on those vestiges of God in creation, those aspects of the created world that have God's fingerprints on them, if you will. Like St. Paul said to the Romans, there's enough evidence in creation itself to know that there is a creator. But then at some point, your meditation is meant to rise above the things in creation to pure contemplation, which is the contemplation of God alone. This is the pure worship of God, not through any created thing, but directly, by focusing on and adoring God in himself, which is to say, in his divine attributes. Now, although all the attributes of divinity can be found in Scripture, in The Soul's Journey, Bonaventure doesn't just proof text them. He reasons his way through them one by one to show how they are all connected. For example, he says that God is absolute perfection and absolute purity. So therefore, God must also be self-existent, because the most pure and perfect being could not be the creation of some other being. Therefore, God must also be eternal. And a being who is eternal must be incorruptible. And a being who is incorruptible must therefore also be immutable or unchangeable, and so on. These are the attributes of divinity. And contemplating all of this should lead us to awe and wonder. And when we bump up against paradox and mystery, that should lead us to more awe and wonder. So fundamentally, contemplation is wonder-filled adoration of God, all in awe of God's very character, which is God's attributes. And for Bonaventure, the most wonderful paradox of all is the Incarnation, in which the first principle, divinity, meets the last principle. Now, by the last principle, he means humanity as the pinnacle of creation, since humanity was created last, that is, on the sixth day. And so Bonaventure says, in him, in Jesus Christ, there is joined the first principle with the last, God with man, who was formed on the sixth day. The eternal is joined with temporal man. And then, after talking about Jesus' passion and cross, Bonaventure says this, all of this was shown also to Blessed Francis, when in ecstatic contemplation on the height of the mountain, where I thought out these things I have written, there appeared to him a six-winged seraph fastened to a cross, as I and several others heard in that very place from his companion who was with him then. And there he passed over into God in ecstatic contemplation. And of course, the result of all of that is that St. Francis received the stigmata. So according to Bonaventure, St. Francis's stigmata were the direct result of his saintly life of virtue and his contemplative prayer, which led him into this mystical experience. And the mysticism of St. Francis comes to us through Bonaventure. And that mystical trajectory that goes all the way back to Pseudo-Dionysius and other quasi-mystical church fathers, and through Bernard of Clairvaux to Francis and to Bonaventure, that trajectory continued on because, of course, Bonaventure was very influential on the later mystics, especially St. John of the Cross. Now, unlike some of our doctors, St. Bonaventure was not an extremist when it came to asceticism. He advocated moderation in terms of food, that is, only moderate fasting, and personal discipline. And he did not recommend depriving oneself of sleep. So, just like with the controversy over poverty, he wanted to find a middle way when it came to ascetic disciplines. St. Bonaventure was no less the philosopher than St. Aquinas. But Bonaventure always seems to want to get right to the so what of a theological point, which is, how does this turn a person's heart toward the love of God? Especially in his mystical writings, speculation always seems to morph quickly into prayer. And so, even though he is called the Prince of the Mystics, he is certainly not the most esoteric or speculative of the mystics. One could say that he's one of the most down-to-earth mystics, which might sound like a contradiction, but that's typical of him, always looking for that balance. And it makes him one of the most accessible mystics, in terms of those of us who want to read the mystical writings. And if the motto of the scholastics is that faith and reason are not in competition, and that one needs faith to exercise God-given reason, Bonaventure would say the same thing about devotion to God and wisdom. True wisdom cannot be found without devotion to God. And so, sometimes he's also called the devout doctor. Both his theology and his mysticism are driven by the conviction that God has both created and done exactly what is most fitting or appropriate. And because of God's attributes of omnipotence and omniscience, God cannot be backed into a corner or made to do anything against his will. And so, on the famous medieval question of whether Christ would have come if man had not sinned, Bonaventure adamantly maintains that the Incarnation is not done out of necessity. The Incarnation is not God's plan B, but was the plan from the beginning. And that's because the Incarnation is not only for the redemption of humanity, but it also accomplishes the redemption and the completion of all of creation. He wrote that the Incarnation, the highest and most noble thing God has ever done, could not simply be a response to sin. It must be the cosmic endgame of all of creation, the perfection of the universe. It is not, in fact, motivated by God's need for a response to sin. It's motivated entirely by God's nature or God's character, which is love and mercy. And not simply some static love and mercy as an emotion, but love and mercy which must be expressed in action and oriented toward another. And in The Perfection of Life, Bonaventure answers the question of apparent degrees of happiness in heaven. He says, "What measure men put into their love of God here will be the measure of their rejoicing in heaven. Therefore, love God intensely here, and your rejoicing will be intense hereafter." St. Bonaventure was canonized in 1482 and officially declared a doctor in 1587 by Pope Sixtus V, who said he was only reiterating what the previous of his name had already done. Bonaventure's feast day is July 15th. Before we wrap up this episode, I'll leave you with a great quote from St. Bonaventure that those of us who read a lot of books can relate to. In the context of the debate over whether the Franciscans should own anything or just use what is owned by the Church or have nothing at all, St. Bonaventure said this about people who want to borrow your books. Those who are the most annoyingly insistent in asking for them are the slowest to return them. Books come back torn and dirty. The person to whom they are lent lends them to someone else without your permission, and that person sometimes lends them to a third, and this third person, not knowing by this time who owns the book, is not able to return it. Sometimes the one to whom a book is lent leaves the place and then is too far away to bring it back. And if he manages to find someone willing to bring it back for him, this person wants to read it before giving it back, or lends it to someone else, and eventually denies he ever had it, until finally one is forced to do without the book while waiting for it to come back dirty or be lost altogether. And so, even in the context of the Franciscan simplicity of life, it seems like it's okay to refuse to lend people your books. And I'm not kidding when I say that I got to the point where when someone asks to borrow one of my books, I just buy them a copy and give it to them as a gift. That solves all the problems. So, if you want to get into reading St. Bonaventure for yourself, well, you have to buy your own copy. Don't try to borrow it. But once again, I would have to say that your gateway in is the volume in the Classics of Western Spirituality series. This contains the life of St. Francis, the soul's journey into God, and the tree of life. And it has a pretty good introduction. So that's your best place to start. And as always, I'll give you a link to that in the description. Well, next time on The Way of the Fathers, and I know some of you have been waiting for this, St. Thomas Aquinas. Thanks for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.